Hello, everybody, and Happy New Year. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour, the first one of 2023. Great. My name is Marie Moran. I am an executive functioning coach with Effective Artistry and joined, as always, by Brandon Tessers, Clinical Director at LCPC. A little bit about Effective Artistry. It's a therapy and coaching practice based in Northbrook, Illinois. For therapy purposes, therapists work with anyone in the state of Illinois. And for coaching, we can work with anyone anywhere in the world as long as you have an internet connection. This is Not Therapy Hour. So as it says on the tin, it's not therapy, it's an open conversation and a chance for us to ask some questions of Brandon about any topic of your choosing. So we normally have a topic prepared. And we have one in mind for today, but if you're in the chat and you want to take the conversation in a different direction, feel free to do so, and feel free to join in and ask questions and give us any comments or thoughts as well. Anything I've left out, Brenda?
No, that sounds great. Yeah, we're hopefully we'll be able to expand the states that we can work with people for therapy in sometime soon, but
Excellent.
Nothing yet. So hopefully that'll change. But yeah. Sounds good. Thank you.
So, Happy New Year. Have you enjoyed the
holiday?
holiday?
Happy New Year to you. Yeah, it's 2023, which is very strange.
Yeah.
I feel like this is like the 5th year in a row where people, probably even more than that, where people have been like, oh, finally, good riddance to 2022. Let's look for it. It's like, I feel like ever since 2016, the end of every year has been like, oh, this was a bad one. Next one will be better,
Yeah. And then the pandemic hit and it just feels like one long year sometimes.
Certainly, yeah. Especially having young kids, like a lot of repetition days are the same, and it is hard to remember sometimes that like my 3.5-year-old now hasn't ever really like experienced non-pandemic life. He was 9 months or so old when everything started. Oh, he's never gone to school without a mask on and all that stuff. He doesn't know that it's unusual.
Yeah, it's I guess in some ways kids they probably adapt better to this than we do.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's all they've known, depending on this is one of those things that I think people have a hard time remembering, including all of us have a hard time remembering is you remember, do you guys have summer break from school in the UK too? Or you grew up in Ireland. In Ireland, do you have summer break?
Yeah, 3 months, I think.
Didn't that feel like forever?
Yes.
Like summer break was like, oh, I have a whole life before I have to go to school again. And then when you got to go back, it's like, oh my gosh, I don't remember what school was like. It's been, and nowadays 2 months, 3 months, it's like, oh, did that happen? I missed it,
Yeah.
It's a much smaller proportion of our life and of our experiences and memories, right? That like we talk all the time about what you notice and what you remember that shapes the way you think, the way you feel. So when a new experience is 1/10 of all of your experiences, it's like, wow, that is 1/10 of the entire universe. And when it's 1/1000th of all your experiences, it's like, it's much smaller. For the reason that it's easier to get resilient. That word has different meanings, I suppose. But anyway, yeah, I think it's an easy, if you listen to kids, which I honestly think is the most important thing for anybody, no matter what you do, listen to children, actually listen to them, find out what they think and what they feel and whatever. Because it's not just about parenting or educating. That's fresh perspective. Mm-hmm. You and I, we cannot think about what life is now without some comparison to what life used to be.
Right.
But we can get a sense of what life is without being. It's kind of like if you have a favorite dish, and then you get somebody like you love, I don't know, lasagna, and then you go somewhere else and you get lasagna. The first thing that you notice is this is not the lasagna that I normally have. So you don't evaluate it as like this is delicious or not. It's wait, that's not what I was expecting, and so that initial response is I don't like this. And it's very difficult to move past that and be like, okay, ignore it. Pretend this isn't lasagna. Pretend it's a different dish. Do you like it? Oh yeah, it's quite tasty. It's just not lasagna or whatever. So, things like masking My son doesn't complain about that because for the most part, it's not actually that big of a problem for people to do. It's just in comparison to not having to mask, stuff like that. Anyway, completely off topic, but yeah, they, adapting or not. I guess I would just say humans are bad at adapting, generally speaking, which is also not true because we're great at it, but we're terrible at it in some ways. Mm-hmm. They don't have to adapt. That's just how it is, you know?
Yeah. So, yeah, as you say, it's all they've known. So
it's part of the reason there's always that generational difference. No matter what generation you look at, the older generation's always saying these young kids these days are messing things up. And the younger generation's always saying those older people are so stuck in the past and they don't understand why this is better. You have to, it's called the anchor and modify heuristic. It's just mental processes. You have to compare every new experience to previous experiences of it. Mm-hmm. So like screen time, for example, which evidence does not support the idea that it is harmful in any way other than opportunity cost, meaning if you spend 8 hours on a screen, that's 8 hours that you're not doing anything else. And what else could you have done during that time? But literally everything has that problem.
Right.
In fact, the evidence is growing more and more. And not that I think this is a good thing, but most people do. That video games, for example, correlate to better performance on cognitive tasks, meaning higher IQ. And most people love that stuff, but still hate the video games because they notice anything that's different that they don't like. Kids these days, anything they don't like, and then connect it to any other thing that is different than their experience. And it's because they're too soft these days. It's because participation trophies. It's because video games. It's literally anything that's different than their experience as a kid.
Yeah.
Anyway, still off topic. That's my long answer. But here we are, 2023.
Yes. And our first topic for 2023, I think, is one that's probably been covered before, but it's probably a good idea to go over some of these things more than once. It's neurodiversity and employment and the challenges that come along with that. So Margaret has been gathering some questions. Margaret Chouse, a therapist at Effective Artistry. If you're on TikTok, if you're watching this and you're on TikTok, you can reach Margaret at Effective Artistry and you can shoot questions her way and she will gather them up and give us a topic list so we can have some stuff that you want us to talk about. So we have a few questions and I was looking up the statistics on this and I was quite shocked actually to discover that in the US, 30 to 40% of neurodivergent people are unemployed or underemployed. In the UK and Ireland, it's about 80%, which was a huge number. As far as I was concerned.
A lot of that has to do with identification processes and like the specific definition and metrics you're looking at to define underemployed. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's cultural differences and things, but mostly those cultural differences impact those two variables. How do we officially identify and diagnose somebody as being neurodivergent in some way? What do we even count as neurodivergent? And how do we identify underemployed?
Yeah.
Because it was only in the UK, the vast majority of diagnosis takes place through the NHS. And it was literally only 5-6 years ago, maybe 7, that the NHS even started doing diagnosis for adults, 18 and over. Before that, it was literally, you could not get a diagnostic process started.
The part of Scotland I was in, there was no diagnostic process for adults until about 2 years ago. So, or 3 years ago. It'd be 3 years ago.
Super long. And so part of that is it's more likely. And it's not like the US has been doing it for a lot longer, but for longer. So the population of people identified as neurodivergent in the UK is going to be disproportionately, as compared to the US, disproportionately weighted to people who are identified as children, diagnosed as children. And that's going to carry some different things. Like, for example, if you're getting identified as a child, it's much more likely that you're struggling to function in the academic environment to the expectations of people around you.
Yeah.
Whereas there's a lot of neurodivergent people who get through school not only fine, but like ace everything. It costs them a lot frequently, but even then, not always. Some people are well suited to it. Even though they're neurodivergent, doesn't mean that you can't be well suited to the academic environment. So we have a large population of adults who are neurodivergent, got through school, but only by pushing themselves past their limits. And then that pattern has replicated in their occupation, that they push themselves past their limits because that's what's normal. That's what they've been doing since they're 5 years old in school, and they don't get identified until later. And so those people are less likely to be unemployed or underemployed because they didn't get diagnosed until after, like they're working in these jobs that are associated with their fields and whatever. And it's only the struggles later on to get them identified. And I'm making all this up. I'm not making up like the things that, the factual statements about when diagnosis opened up and the trends that we're talking about. But this story, it's not like there's some research out there that says this is the way that it must be. We're just making logical connections. But part of the point is whether or not these logical connections hold up, there's always way, way, way more to the story than is presented. Every metric has a million other variables that go into how that metric was selected. Every statistical result, there's something we call p-hacking, which just means that quite frequently in research, people will start with, I need to find this result. They go and get a bunch of data, and then they just do different ways of analyzing the data until they find one that supports the conclusion that they were going in looking for. So I always want to make sure that people are being cautious about, you hear X is connected to Y. Well, there's a lot behind that. It's not as simple as it sounds in the headlines. Anyway, yes, large portion of neurodivergent people are unemployed and underemployed for sure.
So the question is, what are the reasons for that? That's a big question, I know.
Very many. Well, some of it we were just discussing, so that's good, because I was feeling guilty about being off topic right at the beginning. But that's a big part of the answer to this is, how do we identify someone as neurodivergent? And a large proportion of the people who get identified as neurodivergent are identified because others around them, especially young, when they're in the school system, other people around them are caused problems by their behavior. That they're misbehaving in class, which if we recontextualize it, we wouldn't call it misbehavior. That's just how they process or how they regulate or whatever. But it's against what the expectations are of that environment. And because of that, it causes problems because the environment is constructed with a certain pattern of behavior and experiences in mind. And anything other than that needs to be addressed separately. Even if you don't think it's bad, it still takes extra to address it. So it still causes problem. It's a drain on me, the teacher, to have to do some extra thing, even if I think it's totally reasonable and good to support them. And that's likely going to translate into the same thing in the workplace, because the workplace and school, the academic environment, are designed around each other. They're designed to mimic each other. The stated purpose of the educational system, well, I guess I shouldn't say the stated purpose, because the stated purpose is to educate people, but no one really defines what that means. If you look at the metrics by which we measure success in academics, it is all eventually tied to employment.
Right.
Because it backtracks through the university system and through high school and through middle school, even down. We're always talking about readiness for the next level. And in the university system, readiness for the next level is employment. Do we produce employable people? So, and I want to be clear, I know a lot of people are talking about school teaches conformity, not content and whatever. The truth is it teaches both to the best that it is able. Like when you have a structure where you have to teach 20 children all at once, you have to have a certain level of conformity to be able to do anything. You can't have one teacher teaching 20 children and each of those children gets to do whatever works best for them individually. That's just not possible. So is a fair criticism, and there are certainly lots of things that we could and should do better or differently. And it's the same thing for the workplace. Both of them are hierarchical systems, meaning you have levels, and with each successive level, people on that level have more power than the people on the level below. We can define that in different ways. And there are fewer on the next level up, and on the next level up there are fewer and there are fewer. It is really one of the like only workable ways to manage any large scale system with any kind of centralized standard or quality or whatever criteria, right? Has to be in this top down, that some few people make the decisions, then they disseminate that to the next level, who disseminate to the next level, to the next level, to the next level. So there isn't any opportunity for the people at the bottom, the students, to talk to the people at the top, which in this case, a lot of the times, at least in the United States, is state legislatures, like politicians who are making decisions about what things are important to be in the curriculum, of course, advised by educators to whatever extent they are. So there's not much room for adaptation because the people making the decisions are isolated from the things that are happening, and the people who are experiencing what's happening are isolated from the people making the decisions. And that doesn't mean that teachers are bad, right? Like, even though the school system relies on conformity, that doesn't mean teachers are evil people who just want everyone to be robots. It means that they're doing the best that they can do in the position they're in, where they have to answer to the people above them, and the people above them, the administrators, are doing the best they can do, and blah, blah, blah. So that's one of the reasons, is because these environments are structured around hierarchy and conformity. One of the things that's been, well, that's really off topic. We'll get to that. I was going to talk about like the tech industry and disruption and why they think of neurodiversity as differently, but it takes extra resources, right? Like, if I'm running a pizza place and I just need somebody to be able to take the pizza out of the oven and put it in a box and put the box where it needs to go, which I think of as not a very specialized skill set. I could teach anybody to do that. And I have candidates who communicate the same way that I do and are very easy for me to teach, because I can say it once and they get it, because they fill in the blanks the same way I would and they read the context the same way I would. And another candidate who, even if I think is perfectly capable of doing the same thing, and even if I think that what I'm about to say is unfair, it still ends up with, this person requires more of my time for the same outcome as this other person. So people hire people that are mostly like them as much as possible, which also means that neurodivergent hiring managers are more likely to hire neurodivergent people. Anyway, I guess that's probably going to be relevant to other questions later. But really, it's a lot of that, and a lot of the fact that a lot of neurodivergent identification, especially in terms of autism, is we're identifying people who struggle to communicate in like words at all, or intermittently verbal, right? Nonverbal or intermittently verbal, which does make it difficult in most workplaces that are centered around that. There's sensory overwhelm issues when you've got to go to the work environment. And of course, a lot of this stuff is starting to change as we're doing more work from home or work from anywhere arrangements. There's socialization stuff that happens when you go to the environment. Everyone knows there's office politics and office gossip, and that can be harder for people. So it's not always gatekeepers keeping neurodivergent people out. It's sometimes neurodivergent people going there, realizing they don't like it and leaving, or don't like it, or maybe can't handle it, or whatever version of it somebody would say.
I think, yeah, that was one of the questions, actually. What kind of interpersonal issues might you come up against if you're neurodivergent in a non-neurodivergent workplace?
That's a good question, and let's skip to that. But I just want to quickly say the third like major reason I would point out for why there's struggles. Oh no, I lost it. Hold on, I can get it back. What were we saying? We're saying that harder to get in. Once you're in, it can be more difficult for people to. Oh, the third is neurodivergent people are much more likely to push themselves to the point of burnout. That two different people who both have the same roles and responsibilities, a neurodivergent person versus one who is not a neurodivergent. I hate these labels.
Yeah.
But for practical purposes, if, for example, if your workplace, as most do, say that you're expected to work for 8 hours a day, well, nobody does that. You can't. You can do it for some period of time, but it's unsustainable, and then you eventually end up burning out. So what happens? Some people, they just don't care what they're told to do. They understand, or maybe it's not an understanding. Maybe they just assume they understand, even though it's not what is intended to be understood. They're like, okay, they say 8 hours a day, but really they just mean like, get your stuff done.
Yeah.
Some people will hear it and say 8 hours a day. Oh crap. Oh man, I'm only doing 6. Like, what's wrong with me? And they, like, I would say there are so many, at least in America, and this is definitely a projection off of small anecdotal data, but there are so many small scale businesses where it's really like one neurodivergent person is running everything and making everything work, and everybody else is just kind of along for the ride. You know, like there's that joke in the university system often that like the dean doesn't run everything, the president doesn't run everything, the head of the department doesn't run it. The person who actually runs everything and knows the answers to all the questions is someone with a title like assistant to the assistant to whatever. And everyone knows, yeah, don't talk to them, go to this person. You know, like,
Yeah.
it is, neurodivergent people are much more likely to be taken advantage of, because again, the only thing we can say definitively about anyone who identifies as neurodivergent is they have a concept of themselves and a concept of normal, and that those two things are significantly different in some way that they believe is impactful on their performance, their experience, their thoughts, their feelings, their communication, and at least to some extent negative, which means if you think you're normal and you're struggling with something, you're much more likely to say, well, that's because this thing is built wrong. Because if I'm struggling with it and I'm normal, then normal people would struggle with it. And this is therefore, a poor thing, poorly constructed thing. If I am not normal in ways that I know make it so that I'm struggling with things that other people don't necessarily struggle with, and then I struggle with something, I'm much more likely to say I'm struggling because of me, because I'm deficient in some way, because I'm doing something wrong. And so I don't do as much questioning what it is that how this is constructed. I just kind of jump automatically to, I'm screwing it up again. This is my ADHD getting in the way again. And so I don't address, we tend to not be as good about setting boundaries and saying no. We tend to be much more focused on making everyone happy, because we tend to be much more disproportionately impacted by the idea that someone might not be happy with us. It's not an easy thing to just say, oh yeah, they're pissed at me. Oh well, whatever, they're wrong. It's like, they're pissed at me and I know they're wrong, but how dare they be pissed at me and I'm still thinking about it and blah, blah, blah. So those would be my 3 like major categories. Remind me what the question we were going to switch over to is.
What kind of interpersonal issues are we likely to come up against in the workplace as neurodivergent people?
Same as anywhere else, which is just the way that communication is structured, because of cognitive miser, because of all these things we talk about all the time. People say and do the bare minimum of what they think is necessary in order to accomplish what it is they're trying to accomplish, which means nobody ever is saying exactly what they mean, because you can't really. Like, I talk a lot and I choose my words carefully and I go slowly and take my time. I still can't say anywhere near everything that I'm thinking. And even if I could, whatever words I end up choosing, it's never going to be like, yeah, that's exactly it. It's just going to be, this is the best I can come up with of how to give an impression of what it is I'm thinking. Now, the more that it causes you problems, miscommunications, either people interpreting you differently than you intended or you interpreting them differently than they intended, the more that that causes you a problem, the more your brain is going to shift resources onto paying attention to communication. And is someone interpreting me the right way as I intended? Am I interpreting the way they intended? And so on and so forth. Which again, neurodivergent people, if you identify as neurodivergent, you have most likely shifted a good amount of resources onto observing the fact that I don't always understand what other people are saying to me, and other people don't always understand what I'm saying to them. It's not unique to neurodivergent people, but not everybody pays attention to it to the same extent, right? But so that's going to be the problem, is that you're going to misinterpret people and they're going to misinterpret you. And when you have the added piece of, we're not friends, right? Like, this isn't us sitting around chatting about, something that we find interesting for fun, and we can talk about it as long as we want and whatever. We are intended in this work environment to produce something, to accomplish something. And so most of our communication is centered around somebody needs something from me in order to do what they're trying to do, or I need something from them in order to do what I'm trying to do. So we're trying to be efficient. And so we default even more to just quick. One of the most common complaints for neurodivergent people is, how long does it take you to read and respond to emails? Why can other people just dash off these emails real quick. And for me, it's like takes 2 hours to write 2 paragraphs. Yeah, because we're much more focused, generally speaking, on communication and interpretation and blah, blah, blah. So that's part of it. And it is scary to think like, okay, if I dash off a quick email that says 1 sentence, what if they think I'm being terse or rude or demanding? I'll never know because they'll never tell me, because that's not the nature of our relationship, where they're going to come back to me and say, hey, just so you know, you came across as terse. So I just have to guess and wonder if they're thinking that. And because I think about communication more than most people do, I'm going to think about that a lot. But the things that I've learned to help kind of navigate that, to communicate and stretch it out and be more clear and use metaphors and all this other stuff, I don't necessarily have the same access to, or it feels like at least. And then you layer on top of that professionalism, which is the idea that we should all have some similar understanding of what is good behavior versus bad behavior, or appropriate versus inappropriate behavior in the workplace, which again, no one does. We don't actually all have the same understanding. But if I think of myself as different and deficient, I'm much more likely to be aware of the fact that I don't understand what everybody else seems to be understanding. And if and when there's a problem, I'm much more likely to think of it as I'm causing the problem because I missed something and they must all understand it together. But like sexual harassment, for example, is not something, anecdotally speaking, that I would say neurodivergent people do disproportionately. If anything, I would say the opposite seems to be true, where we're extra careful. It doesn't mean it never happens by any means, but that trends wise. So that's inappropriate behavior, but we just think of it differently, right? Like we put that in a different, oh, that's just someone being a jerk, not someone being bad at understanding how different people will interpret what they're saying and blah, blah, blah. Even though those people will often say, okay.
Well, I was just going to say, I imagine with workplace bullying, neurodivergent people are less likely to be the perpetrators, possibly more likely to be the victims as well.
I mean, same as what we're saying here. It's where we're taking this off of anecdotal evidence and projecting big things, because lots of neurodivergent people can be bullies and be sexual harassers, especially men who adopt toxic masculinity standards as the correct way to be masculine and, you know, follow it by the rules. I would say there's a lot of overlap between hyper, you know, like men's rights and whatever, and neurodivergence. Because a lot of neurodivergent people, again, we're saying, I don't seem to understand this, something seems weird, something seems off, and I'm not getting it. One common response to that is to say, well, then I'm going to learn the rules.
Yeah.
This is a very stereotypical autistic thing across the board. What are the rules? Explain to me the rules. I know that is part of the reason that when we're struggling, we have a tendency to say, like, how do I do this? What are the rules about how to do this? And there just aren't any, but we think that there aren't. Well, there's a lot of people out there who are very happy to provide you with a set of, here are the rules, follow these. And some of those are great and some of those are terrible. So it doesn't protect from that. But I'm just saying, it's not like it's disproportionate that we definitely are behaving unprofessionally more than people who are not identified as neurodivergent. So that professionalism piece, as with any other rule set, especially a hidden rule set where like nobody's explicitly stating what you should or shouldn't do, and therefore I'm just watching patterns of behavior to try and assess, like, it seems as though people are behaving as though this is appropriate and this is inappropriate. That can cause me a lot of distress and take a lot of extra time and energy and working memory and attention to focus in and try and figure it out. And again, if you think you're normal and you're struggling with something, versus if you think you are different from normal in some bad way and you're struggling with something, in which case are you more likely to tell someone that you're struggling and therefore ask and get help, right? That I very frequently work with people who think that any struggle, like, I don't know how to do this thing, they never taught me, and will get upset about it, but never actually go and say, hey, you asked me to do this thing that nobody ever taught me how to do, because, oh God, what will they think? And that's unprofessional. So a lot of it is looking for rules where there are none, and et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of the day, it's still that hierarchical system, because theoretically the person who should help me navigate all this is my team leader, my manager, my whatever. That's part of their job set, right? But I was going to say most, I don't know most, I think most, but many, at least, people in that leadership position do not care to talk about these things. They will respond as though you are bothering them by bringing this to them. They will respond as though you're being weird or as though you're being a whiner or whatever, which then reinforces the whole like, oh, I guess I shouldn't tell anybody when I'm struggling with something. It's just really crappy communication in most workplaces, which is disproportionately hard for neurodivergent people.
Yeah. We have a few comments here.
It's from my dad. Hi, Dad.
Yeah. Hello. I really like that analogy.
We that are neurodivergent make the best.
Neurodivergent.
Okay.
I'm sorry. We
No.
that are neurodivergent make the best cooks. If we're following a recipe and we don't have all of the ingredients, we come up with something delicious. Our chicken soup has chicken in it and coconut milk. That was meant as a metaphor. The best physician is creative, assuming they can survive school, and the best dad is creative. I like that. Yeah, it kind of it ties in with the question I was going to ask as well. Like, what qualities of neurodivergency make us good employees or make us suited for certain jobs? In your experience, are there certain lines of work that neurodivergent people thrive in?
So the real answer to the first is I can only say one thing, because remember, when we're saying neurodivergent, all we're saying is people who identify as neurodivergent.
Yep.
And there's a broad spectrum, which means anything that is true of one person who is neurodivergent, the opposite is true of somebody else who identifies as neurodivergent. So the only thing I can say across the board that would help people to be good employees or whatever, more helpful in the workplace, two things, I guess. One is theoretically, statistically more likely to have a greater self-awareness. Because again, if I'm identifying here's normal and here's me, and those are two different things, that means I've put more effort into observing myself and how I operate and observing other people and how they operate. So greater self-awareness. The other would be if that theoretically tracks to neurodivergent people are more different than the norm in some way, which I think we can safely say that, even though for a given individual, not necessarily true. Then the flip side of the struggle with communication is I have a different perspective. So if that's helpful in the work that we're doing, so especially if it's creative work, and I don't mean art, I mean creating something, like STEM is all very creative work. The whole point of it, for the most part, is that you're coming up with new stuff that other people haven't come up with before. You don't tend to just be following the same recipes, not always, but a lot of it. If the work we're doing is creative, then it's beneficial for everyone involved in that process to have access to as many diverse and as disparately diverse viewpoints as possible, because something I missed, you'll see, and something you'll miss, I'll see. So as the differences between us increase, the more different we are from each other, the more difficult it is to communicate, but also the more beneficial it is if we manage to communicate. If we're all the same, very easy for us to all communicate, very easy for us to set expectations and all we do the same thing. But anything that one of us would miss, all of us will miss because we're all the same, including problems with the way that we're doing things, but also including potential improvements that we just didn't come up with. So two things across the board. The second one, no, I can't say that there's a field that's better for neurodivergent people, because it's like, even that statement, which I do like, I like that metaphor, and like talking about creativity, that's a very stereotypically ADHD thing. It is not a stereotypically autistic thing. Mm-hmm. The opposite is often true when we're talking about stereotypical presentation of autism, which is, no, I'm going to do the exact same thing, the exact same way every time. And if you change up anything on me, it's going to cause me to melt down. I am not adaptive and creative in that way. So this is part of why we're so careful with how we define neurodivergence and all that, is because even if we're just talking about it as ADHD and autistic, well, then those two things are still very, very different. And in many cases, practically the opposite of one another. What I would say, the metaphor I have used in the past relies on knowledge of the video game Minecraft, so I won't use it as is, but think of it as if I gave you a rule when you were born that you can never spend 2 nights in the same building. Or if I gave you a rule when you were born that you must spend every night in the same building for your entire life. That incentivizes different things. And the person who can't ever spend 2 nights in the same building, they're going to be much better at certain things than the other one, and much worse at certain things than the other one. So if I have to spend different nights in it, well, I'm going to be really good at exploring. I'm going to be really good at adapting. I'm going to be really good at meeting new people and assessing situations for when it's safe or appropriate for me to be able to go into some place. I'm going to know a lot more about generalities. I'm going to know a lot more about people because I've met so many different people. But I'm going to know a lot less about any individual person because I don't stay in one spot to learn about them. And my living space is not going to be tailored to me because what's the point of putting in that effort? Whereas the other side, I'm going to be able to design something in great detail and tinker and modify and tinker and modify and improve incrementally. Oh, I will never be done because I'm going to be here every night anyway. I am just automatically going to be constantly thinking about how could this thing, even though I've already made it really great, how could it be even better? As any new thing happens, it's going to really disrupt me because I've just set everything up in such a way. It might bother me that something changes, but I'll also be pretty good at give me some time and I'll adjust to the changes and make it even better. So some jobs really want the first, some jobs really want the latter. Some jobs want both in various mixtures or equal measure. So yeah, there's not a way to say that. We could divide it up and say, like, what are fields that are theoretically better suited to ADHD or to autism or to dyslexia or various different types of, what we would call being neurodivergent. But broadly, no. Except I guess any workplace in which communication is either less relevant or more resources are spent on making it be better communication.
Yeah. So really the question is how to make workplaces more accessible, more neurodivergent friendly, more accommodating. Yeah. I guess different ways of thinking. And
companies call me in to talk about this stuff with them, but really all we're saying is how do we make workplaces more inclusive? Yeah. To like narrowly define it as more inclusive to neurodivergent people is again antithetical to what the idea of neurodiversity is. The whole point of neurodiversity is that everyone is unique, everyone is different. Not, okay, there's 2 categories of people, normal and neurodivergent. And we're already great for normal, so teach me what I need to do to be great for neurodivergent. That's not how it works. You can't do it that way. So all we can really say is how do we make workplaces more inclusive? And the only way to do that is to prioritize communication and adaptability. Mm-hmm. That we make it easier for people to state to those who have the power to make changes what it is that would benefit them, what it is that is problematic for them, what they're good at, what they're bad at, what they're struggling with, what they're excelling at. We make it easier for those people, for everybody, to get feedback about their performance, their impact they're having on other people, getting feedback from others about what those others seem to think they do well with or struggle with, because our self-evaluation isn't always accurate. We will frequently, and I don't mean we neurodivergent people, I mean we humans, although they're probably more intense with neurodivergent people on average, but we will frequently think we're terrible at something that other people would say we're great at. And we will frequently think we're great at something other people would say we're terrible at, because those things are intrinsically linked. If you think you're terrible at something and you think it's important, guess what you do? You focus on how to get better. So the things that you're the best at usually are the things that you think you're the worst at, because if you didn't think you were bad at it, why would you keep putting so much effort into getting better at it? Whereas the things that you think you're good at are often the things that you are the worst at because you've never bothered to try and get any better. Of course, it's not one-to-one, but So yeah, it's about inclusivity, and it really is about, I mean, ideally, eliminating and replacing hierarchical structure, but that's not a practical answer at this point. Like that's a long discussion, but within the structure that it is, the real answer is that team leads, managers, like the people who are in charge of how teams operate, how groups of people operate, they need to do much, much more in communication and much, much less in enforcement. They need to do much, much more in adaptability, in identifying the things that their staff, their team members, their reports, whatever you call them, the things that those people struggle with and succeed at, the environmental conditions that hinder or help them, and then adapt as much of that as they can to lean into each person's strengths, to devise environments that support and incentivize and facilitate the kinds of things that they're looking for from their team. Mm-hmm. It is not, and this is part of the problem that always happens, is who's the one with the problem is the one on the lower end of the hierarchical scale. I'm the one who's very clear on this isn't working for me, but who's the one with the power to actually change and do something about that problem is the higher up. So it always comes back to, okay, this is great. These are all great ideas. How do I get my manager to do any of it? So it always comes back to communication. And the nice thing is that in the capitalist, structure that we have, which not that I'm a wholesale fan of, but one of the nice things about it is that the people who get better results over time, that their methods will spread, and the people who get worse results over time, their methods will diminish. And of course, there are problem with capitalism is that there are all kinds of things we can do to artificially make poorer processes succeed in the longer term. Mm-hmm. Once you've gotten that power, you can kind of insulate it from other people, even if their processes are better. It's a big part of the problem. But in a lot of the work that we're talking about generally, like, because mostly what we're talking about is information work, knowledge work, office work, like work that involves the brain. Mm-hmm. Mostly we're not talking about physical labor, although we could. That in that process, who's going to be the most successful teams is the ones with the managers, the leaders that do this. Partly in terms of you attract better talent and you keep your talent instead of having to constantly replace them and losing all the best talent because anyone with any better option is going to go somewhere else instead of working for the jackass that they have to work for, But also because you're tapping into that. Even if you're not going to lose your talent to somebody else, like they're going to burn out if they're pushing themselves too hard, if they're doing. Partly because if somebody on my team is struggling with something, I want to know about it as soon as possible. I don't want to find out 2 months later that they've just been pretending to try and work on something that they don't really know how to do it. I want to find out 5 minutes later that they don't know how to do it. And so if I make it easy and safe for them to come to me and tell me that, if I make it clear that I want to know these things, that I'm not upset about these things, then I'm going to get more of that. And that means my process is going to work better. Mm-hmm. So how do we do it? Yeah, it mostly has to go through those people, the people on the higher end of the hierarchy. And that means we need to communicate to those people how it's beneficent for them, how it's helpful for them to do it. Because even if those people are, yes, this is helpful for people and I care about being helpful and inclusive and whatever. Well, they still can't do anything until someone else tells them what they need because they're not doing it for themselves. They're doing it for other people. So until those other people tell me, and B, sometimes when those other people tell me what they need, I'm still going to say no because sometimes it's not feasible. Or sometimes, sure, that would help you, but it would impact other people on the team in a negative way, and I have to find a balance. But if that's the case, and they don't always know when I'm going to say yes or going to say no, it incentivizes them once again to go back to guessing about how I'm going to respond to things before coming to me, which makes it take longer. Blah 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 blah. So we make it clear to them why it's helpful for them, beneficial for them, because then they're incentivized to do it. They don't have to wait around for people to come to them. They will actively, proactively go to people and say, how can I help? Because it makes their results better. It makes their life easier.
Yes.
There's statements about this, right? Like you can do it fast or you can do it right. or better to do it slow and correctly than fast and twice, or, you know, measure twice, cut once. All these phrases about it, which is effectively just, yes, if you're working on something, it can be disruptive to your process when somebody comes to you and says, hey, I need to change something about the process. And you're like, oh, this process has been working for everybody. What? We're in the middle of something. And fine, you can say that and you can shut it down, but then you're going to have to deal with it later. And it's likely going to become a bigger problem by then and take more resources. So you're doing your best to make your judgment of, is it better to take some time to handle this now when it's smaller, or put it off and handle it later when it's bigger? And there's not a right or wrong answer. It's just, we want to make clear to incentivize people. The more you focus on communication in your work, if you're one of these leaders, the better everything will run.
Absolutely. Do you find when you give these talks, do you find that people are open? Managers, team leaders are open
to the extent that I get feedback, yes. But if there's anybody who isn't open, why would they give me feedback?
Yeah,
nobody's going out of their way to say like, no, all your ideas are bullcrap. Like, it's only the people who like it that come to me. But that's also why I communicate these things in the way that I do, why I use all these metaphors, or why I create these experiences. Like if I say to someone, you don't notice everything, and they think, yes, I do. Well, that's why I do the right now, you're not, until I say what I'm about to say 5 seconds from now, and blah, blah, blah about the chair. Because if they disagree with what I'm saying, I can't check that with like everybody I'm talking to and say, what do you think? And address each individual thought. But if I then create an experience for everybody, of course, they'd have to be paying attention and doing it, where it's very clear the point that I'm making. Because usually if they disagree, it means that they're interpreting it differently than what I'm meaning. Nobody has an issue with, no, of course I don't consciously notice the feeling of the shirt against my skin. But they'll often interpret the statement, you don't notice everything, to really mean you don't notice everything that you should, or you don't notice everything that's important or would be good to notice.
Yeah.
And that's what they have a problem with. So I want to clarify. So there's a reason I get asked to do these. Like I calibrate the way that I talk and communicate these ideas to be difficult for people not to be receptive to. Like, it doesn't mean you can't reject what I'm saying, but you have to make larger and larger and further out there assumptions, you know, more wild theories to be able to continue to reject what I'm pointing out. Mm-hmm. That's part of the reason I don't approach it from an ethical or moral point of view of, oh, it's good to be helpful to people even though they're different. I do believe that that's true, but who cares? People either agree with that or they don't. I'm just talking about the process. You cannot deny, the way that I've explained it, you can't deny that having different perspectives means that you're going to have a group of people that catches things more than a group of people who doesn't, but also that means it's going to be more difficult to communicate. I'm not trying to paint it as a rosy picture. Everything, again, neurodiversity, everything is situationally advantageous or disadvantageous. So you need to decide what's more important to you. Is it more important to you to have an easier time communicating with people, but ultimately a lesser product or outcome, or to spend more of your resources on communication and have a more diverse team and therefore have better outcomes? And either answer is valid. Just know that you're making a choice. I'm not telling you which one you should do. I'm just laying it out. This is literally what it is. You can't argue with it. So choose what you want. Mm-hmm. So also, I tend to be invited in by people who are focused on wanting to do better to support neurodivergent people. You know, it's not like people are seeking me out to pay me for a corporate speaking event that hate the concept of neurodiversity. But there's a lot of good data that shows that basically you're old-fashioned as a manager, things go badly for you.
Yeah.
The more you pay attention to what people are saying and adapt to newer progressive ideas, the better you're going to do. Of course, the flip side of that is the longer you've been doing it, the more likely you are to be old-fashioned because this is how it worked for you and it worked for you, so why should it change? And the more likely you are to then be in a higher position of power, and the more progressive you are, the earlier you are in your career and have to fight against that. It's this tension. And I should clarify, I'm not trying to position that old-fashioned is always bad. That's the natural tension of human culture is the younger and the newer always want to change everything, and the older and the more established always want to keep everything the same. And the most optimal stuff is somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
I have to reinvent everything with every new generation. Like, we do want older people to say, look, this is how agriculture works, so that you don't have to figure it out. This is what we figured it out. And then we want to take that and say, okay, great, I've gotten what you've given me. Now I want to work on improving it, which is part of why we focus on utility over accuracy. Because if we fight over my way's the best way, my way's the best way, then we spend so many of our resources on that fight instead of saying, thank you for what you've offered, because I can see the benefit of it. It wouldn't be there if it had no benefit to nobody. And I can also see some places where we could improve, sometimes because there's new options that didn't exist when it was first designed. So it was best at that time, but now things are different and it's better to do it different. Sometimes, yeah, it could have always been this way and nobody saw it because they were building it from the ground up, but I don't have to spend my career building it from the ground up. I get to spend my career focusing in on little nitpicky details. It's just how development works. Like, yes, you were handed one and you worked your whole life to turn it into two. And then you handed two to me, and now I'm turning it into three. Naturally, some of the time you're going to look at that and say, hey, what the hell? Like, I built two, and now you're coming and telling me that it's worse. You have no idea what I started with and what I did to give you this better version, which is, again, I want to go back to communication so that people don't take it as insults. Don't take offense at, hey, what you did is great, and here's a thing that might even be able to improve on it, a thing that I couldn't have done if you hadn't done what you did first. But just like you worked to improve it, I'm working to improve it too. So thank you for giving me that opportunity. It's hard to do that. It's hard going on the hierarchy to talk to anyone higher in the hierarchy about anything being any different than it currently is without them coming away and saying, they're telling me that my process is bad and how they don't understand what I've accomplished. I'm higher up in this hierarchy for a reason. And also, same with all power. Power does not corrupt. I hate that statement. I hate that statement so badly, because all that does is convince people who care about not being corrupt that they shouldn't pursue power, which makes it much easier for corrupt people to keep hold of the power. Power doesn't corrupt. But people who spend their resources on a thing are more likely to get that thing than people who don't, meaning people who are interested in power are more likely to end up getting that power because they're working toward it. And yeah, we could draw some conclusions about, they'd be broad because nothing is applicable to everybody, but we can draw some conclusions about the type of people who want more power and the type of people who don't want more power. It doesn't mean that either is good or bad. Honestly, I would like everybody to pursue as much power as they can, but that leads to other problems and whatever. Anyway, I'm getting a little bit off the rails, but this is what bothers me about this workplace stuff, because it's mostly talked about as, I'm neurodivergent in the workplace. What can I do to make it better? Including, how can I talk to my manager or whomever about what they can do? And that's so incredibly inefficient.
Yeah.
It should be that the people that are higher up are the ones that are focused on, how do I make it better for my staff? So I talk about this a lot. I'm passionate. Anyway, give me something else. I know we're running low on time, but
I mean, I know we have legal protections in place. So at the we have the very basics in place with it. It's called the Equality Act in the UK and things like that you can fall back on if all else fails. But I guess
kinda.
If you've got to that point, then it's definitely a communication issue with your employer if you don't feel comfortable.
Oh, if you're at that point, your relationship with the person is done, because either you're threatening them with legal action or you're taking legal action against them. That's why I'm saying, kinda, like what those things do, like in America, the Americans with Disabilities Act is our version of it. What those things do is broad. They provide equal protection under the law. They prohibit restricting access based on the grounds of certain protected classes, right? But they don't lay out what exactly that looks like, because you can't, in like a broad like federal law, how do you stipulate exactly what equal protection means in every single environment? It's meaning that the enforcement is left to people who have to take legal action. If you think you're being discriminated against, the Americans with Disabilities Act means that if you can prove that you're being discriminated against, you'll win, because that's the law, is discrimination isn't allowed. But you still have to go through the process of proving it in court. And again, which side of that is going to have access to better lawyers and more money and better connections? So it's very difficult to do. So I do try to encourage people not to rely on that, because even if you're hinting at it, even if you're saying whatever you're doing to subtly give the impression of what you're doing might be illegal, it's interpreted as a threat, because it is. What you're saying is, you better shape up or else there will be consequences for you. And that is better to have than nothing. It is better to be able to fall back on, hey, if you keep doing this thing, you're going to be in trouble. But it does not promote good communication. It does not make your situation, your relationship better. So use it when you have to, but really try to do other things first if you can.
So say you're in that position and you feel like you cannot disclose to your employer for whatever reason that you have a disability or you're neurodivergent, and you need some kind of what they call here reasonable adjustments in the workplace.
Reasonable accommodations here.
Yeah. So you're in that situation, you don't feel comfortable disclosing to your employer. What next?
This is one of the things I work with people all the time on. Remember, utility over accuracy. So you could say, I am autistic, and therefore it would be helpful to me if you kept the lights at a lower level in this work environment, so there was less sensory overwhelm or whatever. That's an accurate thing to say. But you can describe the same situation and ask for the same thing without using the same terminology. You can just say, the light is hurting my eyes. Could we keep it down a little bit? You could just say, I'm much more productive when the light is kept at a lower level than when it's brighter. You could say, as many people have, I struggle with fluorescent lighting, without having to attach it to any personal identity label. So part of the issue of neurodivergence, the identity of I am neurodivergent, is that people will often feel as though they need to be able to justify anything that they're experiencing, that they can't just say, this light bothers me, that somehow would be too demanding or too finicky or too whatever. But if I can say this light bothers me because I'm autistic, then it's okay for me to say it. Which once again goes back to, we want the leaders to be more open. I don't want my staff to feel like they have to justify everything to me. Can I do this thing because it's really important, this and this problem? I don't need all that. Just tell me what would be better for you. Because some of the time I can just say, yeah, there's no problem there. Other times I'm going to say, okay, well, I can see that might cause this problem or this problem. And then we can start to talk about the specific reasons and how to balance it as much. But if you have to preemptively justify everything, that takes up so much of your resources that I would rather you be spending on other things. I don't want you to have to sit there being unproductive. Even if I'm just being a purely selfish team lead, I don't want you to sit there being unproductive. I don't want you to sit there struggling. I don't want you to sit there suffering, if I'm being less selfish in how I describe it. But it's all the same thing until you can come up with a good enough justification to give to me. And then even once you have that justification, it still has to be that the thing is bad enough for you to be able to give. In other words, no, you're not going to come to me and tell me that you struggle to meet deadlines because you have ADHD for no reason, because you don't want me to think of you as someone who struggles to meet deadlines. I might not think that way if you say that, but I might. So you're not going to come to me unless it's pretty bad. And then you'll come to me and reveal it because you think it's a bad thing. So my advice to individuals is try to do your best. And this is beneficial for us as people, like as individuals. Do your best to be specific. Don't lump things all together. The whole purpose of a label like autistic or ADHD or neurodivergent, the whole purpose of those labels is to take many different distinct things and lump them together and say these are all connected to each other in some way somehow. So then it's often useful to use that label term that kind of covers all these things that we think are connected some way somehow. But oftentimes people will then just focus on this and lose track of all the specific individual things that are distinct from one another. Does the fact that I sometimes struggle managing my time mean that I must also sometimes struggle to regulate my emotions? No. Do they happen in the same context? No. Are they both ADHD? Sure. But is it always useful for me to just say to somebody ADHD instead of saying, I need to do this to regulate my emotion, or I need this support to regulate how I spend my time? So it's really, really helpful for us, because otherwise, how do you solve problems? Even individually, right? This is something I talk about with clients, even in consults all the time. People say, I need to get better at getting stuff done. What do you mean? I need to get better at getting stuff done. Like what stuff? All stuff, everything. Give me a specific example. You know, like I need to get better at being able to get my essays written and turned in on time. Okay, tell me more about these essays. Well, it's not about the essays. It's about everything. I need to get better. That's not a thing. You can't do that. And neurodivergent people also tend to be intelligent. Remember how we describe that as cognitive focus and pattern recognition and whatever. Not better, just different. We tend to be more intelligent, which means we're more likely to say, this thing happened and this thing happened and all these different things happened that were problems. And I can come up with a way to connect them all. And that connection between them all is that I am neurodivergent. And therefore, if I stop acting like a neurodivergent person, then I will solve all my problems all at once. But as you get more general and generic, you get less defined. That's what it means to be general. I can say, oh, on a day, and that's a very general thing, and any day will qualify as a day. But then if you're saying, how do I have a good day? Well, then any answer I give has to qualify for literally any day. It's very tough to do. If I say on a Monday, okay, well now we're more specific and we can come up with more specific. If I say on the day after more specific is better. So usually when people are saying that I need to disclose, right, that I'm autistic or that I have ADHD, they're doing it because they think that that's justification that's necessary, that nobody will support them unless they can prove I need that support because I am autistic. It's often a big part of the problem with self-identification versus official diagnosis as well in those debates is we have to prove you don't deserve it, I deserve it, right? And there's reasons for that. A lot of that comes from the school system where there are very finite resources and have to be allocated in certain ways. And so we do prioritize and identify who deserves what. But in the workplace, it's not the same because different process equals different results, equals different resources. School is not like that. Whatever happens to the kids, we still have the same budget. But if my employees function differently, perform differently, then my outcome is different, then that might result in more resources. So again, it's beneficial for me to lower that bar of justification of how important it is. So that's on the manager side. On the individual side, it is just about being specific. You don't have to, you might end up having to, let me be clear. You might go to somebody and say, hey, can we turn the lights down in here? It bothers my eyes. And you might get the response of like, what are you talking about? Just deal with it. And you might keep escalating, hey, it's really impacting my productivity. Just get over it. You know, like it might get to the point where you've tried all those things and finally you have to say, I have a medical diagnosis of autism and therefore, et cetera, and they might listen to that. But first of all, if they didn't listen to any of the other stuff before on the way up to that, they're not necessarily going to listen to that either. There's a narrow window of people who would not have considered any of your previous justifications as being worth doing the thing, but the official label will change their mind.
Yeah.
Small window. Happens, but it's a small window. Second of all, you are now in that threat. Again, what you're saying is doctors have said that you must treat me in this particular way. You're comparing them against some other expert. So that they're being told what to do. And that's better than nothing, at least in some cases. But be aware of what it is. Generally, somebody who has not been willing to listen and change up to that point is, even if they're in that window that they're going to change then, is probably going to be pretty resentful about the fact that you've come into them that way.
Yeah.
Which then reinforces this idea that, oh, it's dangerous for me to disclose. Because if most of the time when I'm disclosing to somebody who's pissed at me for asking for something and now feel as though I'm forcing it, then yeah, they're going to be mad at me for disclosing. And then I'm going to say, yeah, managers don't want that. Where a lot of managers, if I just disclose and I'm not asking anything, just so you know, I have ADHD, They won't give a crap. They probably won't even hear it most of the time, because if you don't give them a reason that that information is relevant, I have ADHD and therefore you should, or I need, or whatever. Just I have ADHD. Okay, cool. It's like saying I'm a soccer fan. Like, okay, cool. I'm busy. Like, what do you need? So that's my best answer, is don't jump to the justification. It's worse for you. It makes it harder for you to ask for help. It makes you feel like a burden and a drain. It reinforces the idea that it is bad to be whatever thing that you are thinking is a justification for your request. It makes it harder for you to improve. If I think I have a hard time falling asleep because I have insomnia, then what do I do about that? There's very limited options. Where if I think I have a hard time falling asleep, I wonder what that might be. Maybe it's this, well, I can change that. Maybe it's that, I can change that. So, and if you're a manager or a leader, then open yourself up to new ideas. Ask yourself, is this actually, was it this conversation we were talking about the lasagna thing? No, I think that was in a consult. It's like, if you have a favorite dish, if you love lasagna, your mom makes lasagna and you love it, and then you go, oh, we did talk about, okay, yeah, I get these conversations confused sometimes. Same deal. Try as a manager, when they're coming in and saying something, try to move past just, well, that's different and therefore I don't like it, and into, let me consider this thing on its own merits. Is that something that would actually cause me a problem to lower the lights a bit? It might, depending on what you do and what the environment is and what other people want, but it might not. So instead of just assuming, oh, that's going to cause problems. Of course, again, those people have their bosses that are putting stuff on them, and they're being asked to do more than they have time for. So how do they free up time to do communication? And they have to go to their boss and say, this is why we're changing things. And so whole thing. So it's not easy, but that's the best we can say in a generic sense. We can talk about individuals and what they need to do, or what a specific team or culture or corporation needs to do differently. But generally, lower the bar. Just ask for what you want without. One of the things I say to people all the time is, we generally in this culture have an idea that you should do what you're supposed to do, what your idea of what everybody thinks you should do or is the stated best thing to do, unless you can justify doing what you want instead. And instead, what it should be is do what you want to do unless you have reason to think that it would be better to do otherwise, which is not uncommon. Happens constantly. I would love to take a nap, but I got work to do, right? Like, I would love to be on the beach, but it costs money and time, and I need to be here for, at any given moment, there's tons of stuff you would love to do, but there's reason not to do it. So it's not rare. We're just shifting the burden of evidence from, I have to justify being able to do what I want, versus I have to justify why I shouldn't. Because then you know the real reason, instead of just feeling like, oh, I never get to do what I want. It's, well, I can't do that thing because of this. I can't do that thing because of this. And it's less of a burden. You can follow your impulses. I'm going on and on, but basically every adult I talk to, not even just clients, like just people I meet, like every adult asks these same questions and says these same things over and over, because of these underlying premises of anything I want that's different from what I think is normal is bad, and therefore I shouldn't think about it or do it or want it. I shouldn't say anything about it or pursue it unless I can justify why it's okay, which just slows everything down.
Yeah. And I've often heard it said about like workplace accommodations that, they don't just help the person who asks for them, but very often they help everybody else too, because they make the environment a more comfortable place to be and to work.
Yeah, a lot of them do. And sometimes something that makes it more comfortable one for make it less comfortable for others. But even in that case, it still indicates to that person that this place is responsive.
Yes.
That if they're going to make that change for that person, even though I don't like it, well, maybe they would make some change for me too, which makes it easier for them to talk to you. Like it's a snowball rolling downhill. You start moving in the right direction and it goes further and further that way. And yeah, if you start moving in the wrong direction, it goes further and further that way. People clam up. Mm-hmm. If you have like interpersonal issues on your team, guaranteed 100% you have communication issues that impact your work, not just people's personal lives. So if you just write that off as, oh, people are so petty. No, you've created a context in which people are getting upset about things and not being able to discuss it. even if that's irrelevant to work in terms of a specific, conflict, because all conflict is obviously relevant to work because it inhibits the team working together. I honestly, this is a hierarchical thing too, and I know we need to wrap up, but a huge part of the problem is that, you know what the Peter principle is?
No, I don't think I do.
The Peter principle is the idea that that within an organization, you rise to the level of your failure. Meaning,
Okay.
if you're on this level and you excel, great, we bump you up to the next level, you get a promotion. And you excel, great, we promote you. It's not until you're at a level where you're not doing so hot that we stop promoting you. So people rise until they get to a point where it's like they're struggling and not doing great, and that's where they stay.
Mm-hmm.
If you are a great programmer, well, your lifetime earnings, your power, your flexibility are all limited by the fact that you're not in management. So we take our best programmers and incentivize them to become managers, even if they're terrible managers. And now we're losing out on their great skills as a programmer, but also putting them in a position where they're not doing great as a manager. If we take our best performers and say, you can never get more money or do more, or have more influence in this organization unless you switch over to leadership, then we end up with a bunch of crappy leaders and a bunch of teams where we're constantly stripping them of their best performers. Management shouldn't be hierarchical. It should be hub and spoke. It's not we take our best and move them up and therefore they make more. It's a specialized role. Someone on the team needs to focus on making sure that the whole team is communicating well. They're not in charge or better than. That's just their specific role. Instead of every person on the team has to have a good communication and relationship with every other member of the team, everybody on the team has to have a good relationship and communication with one person, and that person is the hub to transfer everything else around. And there are people, actually, especially neurodivergent people, who tend to focus so much on communication. There are people who are very well suited to that role that have a hard time getting to that role because you have to do something else first, when all you really want to do is talk to your colleagues, like those people on your team or in your workplace that everybody knows them and they know everybody and they have the details of everyone's situation. And when you're struggling with the boss, you go talk it through with them first. And when you're struggling with another coworker, you talk to them first. Like those people very rarely get promoted because they're spending so much of their time talking to everybody, and they're thought of as underperformers and like, just like in school, that is bad behavior, when they would make great communicators if that was their role.
Yeah.
And even
they're the smoother outers, the people who smooth out all the lumps and bumps and difficulties. Yeah.
They're the people who spend a lot of their resources thinking about other people's perspectives and experiences, thinking, how would this person perceive this? They won't always be right, but how would this person interpret this? How would this thing impact that person? And if I'm spending my resources on that, I can't spend those same resources on how do I optimize this particular part of our process? So even within the hierarchical structure, if you're a leader, make somebody have that role on your team, because if nothing else, remember, we got to talk about it the way that is beneficial for the individual that we're asking them to do it. If nothing else, it takes all that crap off your plate.
Yeah.
And you get to focus on the stuff that you are good at and want to do. The reason that you went into that job, if the reason you went into that job is because you like communicating and supporting people and whatever, then great, or you're one of those people we're talking about. If the reason you went into that job was for any other reason besides that, and that part of the job is annoying to you, then create a role on your team. And now you also only have to have a great communication relationship with one person. And you do. You have to listen to them. You have to have good communication with them. But they're the hub. And you only got to talk to one instead of having to talk to all 30. And you get to focus on whatever the other reasons are that you went into that role. It is good for you to do this.
Absolutely. It's what my boyfriend and I call a person who does the peopling. And every organization should have someone who does the peopling.
Yeah. And remember, we were talking earlier, quite frequently, the thing that you feel as though you are the worst at is the thing that you are the best at. And yes, neurodivergent people tend to think they are bad at doing the peopling. They tend to actually be really good at doing the peopling.
Yeah.
Quite frequently, we feel bad because we are picking up on more data, because we're aiming for higher things, because we set higher standards for what we're meant to accomplish. Some people get a C and they feel great. Some people get a C and they feel like a failure. If you get a C and you feel like a failure, it's quite likely that you'll be good at whatever that thing is because you're pushing yourself for that A.
Yeah.
If you feel like you're bad at socializing, because every question, if you get people to get specific about it, what do you mean you're bad at it? I just don't understand what people mean. Nobody does. I don't know all the unwritten rules. There aren't any. I don't interpret people correctly all the time. No one does.
Mm-hmm.
Just some people don't feel bad about it and therefore don't try so hard. And of course, it's not exactly the same. It happens at different rates and blah, blah, blah. But when you get people to be specific about, I'm bad at socializing, what do you mean? The only like legitimate thing that usually comes back is it's draining for me.
Yeah. Or I'm shy.
But why? Why is it draining for you? Because you're picking up on more data. You're expending more of your resources than somebody else for whom it is less draining. I'm shy. Why are you shy? What does that mean in specifics? It means I don't want to say anything. Why don't you want to say anything? Because I'm imagining how it might go. And I'm imagining a lot of ways in which it might go bad, which again means that you're spending a lot of your resources thinking about how people respond to things, how people communicate, what words and tone and facial expression mean to different people. It doesn't mean you can use that information and then perfectly be understood, but you're spending more of your resources on it. Another way of saying this is if you feel bad about anything, you care about that thing. So people who come in and say, I'm just not motivated to do my schoolwork. It's like, okay, well, you're spending your time and energy and money coming and talking to me about getting better at doing your schoolwork. Do you spend your time and energy and money on getting better at things that you don't care about?
Right.
Do you sit and cry on the floor at 2 a.m. because you're failing to do something that you don't care about? You care. If you're thinking, you care. I can't get myself to do the thing that I want to do. That's fine, but it has nothing to do with how much you care. Mm-hmm. And the more you think it does, the more you push yourself to care more without actually addressing the stuff that's the problem, because it's not about caring, but you do care more and the problem persists, so you feel worse. And then you care more and the problem persists and you feel worse. Because a lot of what we do in coaching and therapy is just say, like, what do you mean motivated? I'm not motivated to do my work. What do you mean? And people will then say, I don't know. Because it's not a thing. And then you can look at what might really be happening because it's not about how much you care. Anyway, we're way over time and I'm going on things. Yeah. But neurodivergent people tend to be, we won't go into it some other time. I have some pet theories about like the idea behind neurodiversity is that all these variable traits among people are beneficial to the group, right? That we evolved this way because there's utility to the group to have someone who functions like this versus someone who functions like this. And I have my pet theories about why we as a species would have some people who have the experiences that neurodivergent people have, including why we would be so hyperfixated on what are different people like, and am I the same as them or different than them, and how do we understand each other, and what's appropriate and what's not, what role that serves. Anyway.
Oh, I want to talk about this next time.
Yeah. Thanks for sticking with me, Marie. Sorry we're 20 minutes over.
Not at all. It's good to be here. And, same time next week.
Yeah, same time next week.
All right.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. We'll end the broadcast.